Okay, welcome. So, from charm to Ceratium and beyond. You'll see why it's called that very shortly, I hope. So, it's a journey in holograms or holography, and it's essentially covering more or less my entire professional career from a PhD student to really very recently. And in the talk, you'll see what the relevance of these three pictures are. At least I hope you will. So depending on how much you know about holography, and I guess you're all doing degrees in physics, but in general, people don't, I think, do all that much on optics and holography these days. So I thought I would definitely start by either reminding you or possibly even introducing what holography is. So it's a two-step process, and it's a process of recording an interference pattern. And then taking that interference pattern, once it's been recorded, generated by essentially an object or objects, which might be macroscopically large. You can make holograms of people-sized objects, or they might be, as most of the ones I'm going to be talking about, microscopically small, millimeter or sub-millimeter scale. The hologram is a way of not only reproducing an image of an object, but reproducing the image such that it is replayed in 3 dimensions. There are a whole variety of different forms of holography, but there are only 2 that are relevant really to what I do, which is measurement, as opposed to either art or making clever diffraction gratings for spectrometers. And historically, i.e. up until round about the year 2000, holograms were recorded on emulsions, film, high resolution film essentially. Nowadays, they're recorded using large area CCD or CMOS cameras. So what do you need to know? Well, you need to know that when you replay a hologram, 2 images are produced. Sometimes one is produced more readily than the other, or at least more brightly than the other. There's a virtual image, which is what you see, as it were, if you were looking through the... So here I'm talking very much in the mode of a physical hologram as opposed to a digital hologram. I'll talk about digital holography right at the end. If you imagine a hologram being a holographic plate or a piece of film, you replay the hologram with a laser and you look through the physical hologram medium, you see an image. That's what a virtual image is. Or you can have a real, that's a projected image, which is located in the space between the observer and the hologram, and you could hold up a piece of paper or ground glass screen or something and see the image on it. So let me talk about holography a little bit more. So this is the form of holography which in fact I specialized in for a large part of my professional career. I am a particle physicist, and you'll see why I've also worked in holography shortly. So this is the sort of holography. This is the type that was invented by Denis Gabor back in, I think, 1946, and for which he got the Nobel Prize. So imagine we have a laser beam, which I've represented by this plane wave impinging on a hologram, piece of film, or it could be a CMOS camera, pixelated camera. And we have a small object. It could be a bubble, could be a marine plankton, could be a piece of dust, could be a seed. It's going to diffract the light. It's going to form a weak diffracted beam. I've shown it here. If it's a small object, it's roughly speaking a spherical wave. And these will interfere, produce an interference pattern here, and that's what's recorded. Now, the other type of holography, which is off-axis, this is the sort of holography that produces interesting holograms that you see in art galleries and things of that sort. We have a laser beam. We have a second laser beam, which is typically, well, it has to be phase related. So you take one laser beam, split them into 2 via a set of mirrors, bring this in at an angle. And if you imagine there being no object here at all, what we're actually forming here is a sinusoidal diffraction grating, such as you'd find in a modern optical spectrometer. Most diffraction gratings these days are made by holography. If I then put an object into the second beam, which is known as, so this was known as the reference beam. This beam here is known as the object beam. If you put objects in the object beam, then we record not only this diffraction pattern, but we also form another additional phase-related diffraction which is connected with the object. And the way these are recorded and replayed and the properties of them are really very different. So here's a more realistic picture of recording an inline hologram. Here's the laser beam being expanded, essentially to make it collimated. It doesn't have to be collimated, but there are lots of good reasons why you might work. So just a parallel beam of light. This essentially is a telescope used in reverse. Here we have, for example, a tank filled with objects. And here we have the recording medium, or these days, a digital sensor. What do we do to replay it? We put it back in the same laser beam we started with, a collimated, if it's collimated. Here's the holographic plate. So again, I'm skipping back 20 years or so in technology, but it kind of makes the description easier, and a lot of my holograms are recorded this way. It forms simultaneously a virtual image that you could see, as it were, through the plate itself, or the emulsion. It forms a real image which you could project onto a sheet of paper. And what you're actually doing, or what I'm doing, or those of us who made these sorts of holograms were doing, was essentially using this to record something from another medium. Maybe it was underwater, maybe it was in a hazardous environment, or maybe it was just not accessible. Small objects, and the replay then allows you to move a conventional optical microscope through an aerial image. Now, you might say, well, why not use the microscope in the first place? Well, the problem with that is that microscopes are very good at resolving small objects, as I'm sure you know. But if you have a high magnification, such that you can get high resolution on the scale of micrometers, tens of wavelengths, or that sort of scale, the slice in depth, which is in focus, is very, very small. So if you know that all your objects are located exactly here, then you might as well use a microscope. If you don't know within a large volume in depth where they are, then you can't do that. You can if they're static, but if they're moving, like plankton, or if they're transient, like bubbles, that simply doesn't work. And that's the reason for making holograms by this technique. I won't say very much about off-axis holography, but I think it's just important to show that the replay is rather different. This time we replay with what's known as the conjugate beam. It's coming backwards through. So imagine in the recording, this was the object beam here. In the replay, it's the same beam going backwards, as it were. Now, if it's a parallel beam, it literally is the same beam. But if we recorded it with, as we could, with an object beam which was, say, expanding, we would replay with a replay beam that was converging. Once again, we get a three-dimensional image. And the big difference that off-axis holography enables that you can't get with inline, two things. One, you can record much larger objects, macroscopically large objects. And secondly, this is the type of holography where not only is it replayed in 3 dimensions, but it has what's known as parallax. Parallax is where you can look at it from different angles, as I'm kind of demonstrating by moving my head around, if you're looking at a picture of me as well as the screen. So it got some advantages over the inline. It's more technically complex, and actually it doesn't have the same level of resolution, but it does allow you to record large objects. Okay, stepping way back in time to when I was a young, recently graduated student, particle physicists were interested in particles containing a charm quark, which was an exciting new particle back in 1980. Now these hadrons with charm quarks in, they could be mesons or baryons, of course, they've got short lifetimes, about a picosecond. Now that's quite long. If you think of sort of particles that we're interested in at the Large Hadron Collider, like the Z0, W, the Higgs, they've got lifetimes which are smaller by a factor of a million, and therefore essentially infinitely short. So here I've just copied from the latest particle data group book, the DMeson, which is one of the things we were looking for. It's got a lifetime, as I say, of a picosecond, which means its proper distance, proper lifetime times c is about 1/3 of a millimeter. Now, of course, lifetime is it's like radioactive decay. So after 5 or 6 of these distances, you probably have very few that are actually going to have lived that long, but some of them will. So the visual particle detector of the era, although just about to be replaced by shiny new silicon strip detectors, was the bubble chamber. And there were huge bubble chambers operating at CERN, the big European bubble chamber, the largest one I think ever made. Really, really very big, with bubbles in it of the order of about 1/3 of a millimeter. Bubbles, what we have is essentially a superheated liquid. A charged particle loses energy by ionization, depositing it along its track. You then reduce the pressure, and just like taking the top off a bottle of soda water, bubbles appear, and those bubbles appear at the point where energy was lost from a charged particle. And then after a short time, the bubbles grow, and you take a picture. In a conventional chamber, you take it with a brief flash of white light and conventional film. In a holographic bubble chamber, and here's a sketch, in fact, from my thesis, you take a laser going through here and a piece of holographic film on the other side. So the particles would come in here, they interact with the fluid. Sometimes, rarely, they will produce one of these DMesons. It will decay in here, and that's what you're trying to find. So the great advantage here is that we, with holography, can now take the, so we're using a pulsed laser, actually the laser equivalent of a flash lamp. We can now let the bubbles grow only a very, very small amount, so they're tiny, but we can now locate them anywhere within this depth of 50 millimeters. So we don't have to confine them to what would be about 0.5 millimeter at best if we were using a conventional microscope. They can occur anywhere. And essentially we recorded a large number of holograms. I still think this is probably a world record, 40,000 unique holograms recorded in 17 days. And actually we used something which was unique again, I think, for the time. So the big European bubble chamber had some muon identification. So these particles here can decay into obviously a lighter meson plus, say, a muon, and that's a signature of this type of particle. It allows you to preferentially select the ones you want. It's trigger in modern parlance. But what happened with the conventional chamber is you took a picture every time the chamber expanded, and then you used this offline, as it were, afterwards to say frame 4327 had a muon. What we did was to rapidly cycle this chamber 10 times every second, so it sounded like a machine gun going off. And then we only took a hologram when the muon detector had recorded a muon. So I'll say a little bit what my contribution is, but first of all, let me actually show you what a hologram of an inline hologram looks like. So this thing that looks like a very blurry picture is in fact the interference pattern that is the hologram. These fuzzy looking tracks are indeed the holographic images of bubbles. They have circular symmetry, and they also, you can see, I hope, we've got fringes going out from them along various sides. I think you can see here that we have indeed got one track coming in and a number of tracks going out, and that's exactly what's happening. Fairly high momentum proton is coming in, it's interacting with a proton or a neutron in the freon, a refrigerant, which is what we were using in here, and we're getting mainly pions, because that's what you always get when you hit protons into nucleons. Anyway, this is what you then need to replay, and then you need essentially a computer-driven microscope to find the interesting events, and that was what I built. So here is something I'm still tremendously proud of. It's a machine I designed at University College for my thesis. Here is a laser. Laser is expanded. Here is a roll of holographic film. You can see the individual frames. And then under these boxes, here are two very old-fashioned video cameras. These would be about a cubic centimeter nowadays for the same technology. here is what it looks like when you take the lid off. Some lenses giving you two different magnification views. You've got everything moving on X, Y, Z stages, so that once you bring something into focus at a particular point, you know its coordinates. So this is a replayed hologram. Here you can, and showing two different magnifications, which is what we had simultaneously. That's why we have two light paths here. One's a high magnification view, and one's a low magnification view. So here you can see the proton coming in, the bubbles along the proton. So remember, these are 10 micrometers in diameter. Here it's interacting. Here is your forward-going cone of primarily pions. Here's one going off at a slightly larger angle. And this happens to be another 10 millimeters downstream. So you can begin to see the tracks expanding. You might notice, I'm sure you can notice actually, that there's this track here, which looks much more dense in terms of its image. That's because it's heavily ionizing. If you've done any sort of particle physics detector development type study, then the slower a particle moves, if it's ionized, if it's charged, or the higher the charge, and this might be a nuclear fragment with a charge greater than 1, the more it loses energy per unit distance, and that's exactly what you're seeing here. So you make measurements, you try and find a point down here where something is decaying, say a neutral particle into a V of 2 charged particles, or one of these tracks suddenly splits into 3, charge conservation. Just in case you're familiar, as you might be, with the classical bubble chamber pictures, there's no magnetic field here, so all these tracks are straight. Okay, so I thought that was pretty much the end of my interaction with holography. I did a little bit more, but to my surprise, about 15 years later, I got involved in using holography to record marine organisms as part of an EU program called HoloMar. The idea here was to produce an underwater holographic camera to look at plankton. So plankton are the start of the food chain for everything in the ocean. There are essentially two sorts of plankton. There are plant-like plankton, and there are little animal-type plankton that eat the plant-like plankton. And then the little animal plankton are eaten by bigger animal-type plankton, and then those are eaten by small fish, and then or shrimps or things of that sort. And then those are eaten by bigger fish or whales, and then sadly, some of them, I guess, get eaten by us. But anyway, it is the start of the food chain. And what people know a great deal about plankton, but actually they don't know that much about how they spatially interact, for the same reason that they are very small. They're on the scale of a few micrometers to a few millimeters. So it's the same issue as in the bubble chamber. How do we record how these things are spatially, do the predator plankton sit in the same place in the water column and wait for the plant plankton to move up towards the light, or do they kind of chase them around, or what? People just don't know. The idea, so here I've just listed some of the, you're doing a non-destructive in situ interrogation of species in the natural environment as opposed to fishing them out. You've got three-dimensional images, and essentially some of these communities, actually, even if you only care about recording what lives on or near what, are very physically fragile and fall to bits when you sample them. So this holographic camera was big. It would be a lot smaller now, but this is one of the last, probably the last use of holography with holographic film or plate, glass plates. That's partly why it's so large. You also need a very powerful laser. You can see how big the laser is. You can see how large this is two of my colleagues. So you can see that this is about a meter or so in diameter and about 2 meters long. And this is a large pressure vessel because this has to be submersed. And this was able to go down to about 200 meters. And the 200 meters is about the depth at which plankton essentially stop living because there's no light below there. The light is just attenuated. Also, we designed the system to make use of both of those two types of holography. So here's the inline beam. Remember, this is the one that's optimized for high resolution recording of objects which are on the scale of a millimeter or smaller. And then in the same volume and overlapping with it, you've got the opportunity to record an off-axis hologram, which has got poorer resolution, but can cope with, and here's doing a test firing, I guess, for publicity purposes. Here we're dangling a toy latex, silicone rubber or whatever, a jellyfish, just to give you an idea of the scale. So if that was there, that would not record on the inline, it would just block all the light, but we would get an off-axis hologram image. Once again, my contribution, or my major contribution, was to build a replay machine. This time I have to replay both off-axis and inline, not simultaneously, but separately. So I've got a laser, I've got a beam expander, I've got a mirror that in this case would send the light through an off-axis hologram, and once again I've got a computer-controlled microscope, allowing us, this time with a CCD camera, technology's moved on in these 15 years, to allow us to interrogate this volume here. If it's an inline hologram, we move this mirror down here and we replay this way. Here is HoloScan, here's the laser, there's the beam expander. Here you can see the expanded beam. Here it is hitting the mirror. Here it is going through the off-axis hologram. And here you can see the camera and a magnification lens at the front. So we're looking at the image here. Well, what did we find? Well, here we launched it. Lockett, it was a large sea lock in Scotland. It's being launched. Pleased to say it didn't sink. And here are some live Calanoid Copperpods. So that's a fairly common type of animal-like plankton. That's almost a millimeter long here, and these long antennae are about 2 millimeters long. And here you can see the sort of resolution we can get. So these little whiskery things here, you can quite clearly see individually resolved, are on the scale of 20, 30 micrometers in diameter. Now you don't see, once the object gets to be this big, so remember this thing here, the body of the object, that's like Calanoid Copperpod, is on the scale of a millimeter, you don't really get to see any detail of this at all. This is acting a bit like just an opaque object. But you get a great deal of information. And of course, you don't know what orientation these things are going to appear in. That was quite exciting. Right, so this was, to say, the last possible time, effectively, that anybody anywhere in the world really, I've got a question. Why have holograms been used to observe the main object? Right, okay, so the point is that in order to resolve this, well, if you wanted to see this, the body of this object on a scale of a millimeter, you could indeed take and indeed people do, by the way, people have been recording these photographically for 50 years plus maybe. These things themselves eat very tiny plankton, which are essentially plants. But the tiny plankton they eat are on the scale of those bubbles of the bubble chamber. So even though you could probably resolve this with a high quality, high resolution conventional camera, you would not be able to see the little things that this thing was feeding on. Therefore, you wouldn't know whether this was surrounded by lots of things that it was eating or whether it was just floating freely in the ocean. So it's trying to get those two very different scales imaged at the same time. So let me quickly move on to the 21st century approach to holography, essentially. This is probably the last scientific use. People still make use of film-based or glass plate-based holograms for artistic purposes, and they're still actually used for making master holograms of the type that are then used in, say, banknotes or credit cards. But in terms of science, that was probably the very last time. What we do now is to record what are known as digital holograms. So let me just say what's going on here. So this is an object out of focus, or rather not out of focus, I mean it's the hologram of an object. and I'll use it to illustrate some of the features of holographic imaging. This time it's an inline hologram again, so it's going straight through the object. There's no separate reference beam. And the recording medium is now not a piece of film, but a video camera. And when we replay the data from the video camera, we replay it by essentially using a computer algorithm that effectively takes a two-dimensional Fourier transform. It turns out mathematically that what you're recording here is very closely related to a Fourier transform of the object. And that means that little objects, remember Fourier transforms, reciprocal space, a small object will have large fringes, a large object will have very small fringes. So this thing here is actually a small, probably speck of dust on the object or on one of the lenses, giving more or less undifferentiated circular fringes with quite a wide spacing. These things here is something which is much larger and giving us a more complicated object. If you then replay this by computer, you can find out what these objects are. This one is not in focus, so it's not in the same physical depth plane as these. This thing here says C3. This thing here is actually the thing I was interested in. This is a test object. It's two little discs. So this is effectively a very flat glass block, and these are some letters and some little discs that are put on there to test the resolution of the holographic system. And these are about, I think in this case, 200 micrometers across. What you might be able to see, and you will certainly later, you can see actually here two things. One is this is in focus, but you'll notice those little fringes still around it. That's because that's again a feature of not so much holographic imaging, but the fact that what we've got here is a sharp cut, effectively a sharp cut filtering process, such that we get what's known as ringing. It's the same thing you'll have if you put a fast pulse through an electrical filter, which has a pass band which is uniform, and then at some cutoff frequency goes abruptly to zero. The pulse will come through, but you will then get these additional fringes. And you can also see them here coming in from the edges. And that's genuinely coming in from the edges of the system as well. So you get artifacts in holographic imaging or coherent light imaging, strictly speaking, which you don't get in incoherent imaging, such as we normally do with say photographic cameras. Okay, so again, I'm moving forward 15 years almost from the previous experiment, and a rather unexpected application of holography, certainly for me, unexpected application of holography. For a year, I worked quite closely with an artist, Jane Wilton, who was particularly interested in recording breath. That was her. And I worked with her on a number of optical techniques for recording breath. And at some point I said, well, I don't think we can record breath, but we could record you blowing some small things if you wanted to have a go at making some holograms, this time digitally. So we had a go at doing that. And so the setup is, again, very simple in principle. You have a laser. This time it's a pulsed green laser like we used for the underwater holograms, except it's not quite as powerful. It's still actually quite dangerous, but it's not as powerful as the one in the underwater system. Again, we have essentially a telescopic beam expander here, and this is a large area digital camera. And here is a shot taken with a conventional camera showing you the beam path. And in this region here, you can see a rather blurry picture of Jane. This is where she's going to blow some of these little pollen grains. So this is pine pollen. Again, these are of the order of 0.5 millimeter or so in size. And what we do is to make a hologram and then replay it. Now this is always tempting fate. This is the point I'm going to try and show you the video of this. I'm going to click on this, which says new share, Just hopefully means I can share this. So someone better tell me if this doesn't work. So hopefully so someone better say either in the chat, or you should be able to see a screen with sort of blurry gray things. It's working, says somebody. Great. Right, so what you're going to see here is a real-time GPU assisted replay of this hologram. So this is not being, what you're seeing here is a video that is being this is a hologram being replayed at different depth planes by essentially repetitively doing this two-dimensional Fourier transform, but with a different essentially phase factor in front of it, and that phase factor depends on what depth plane you want to replay. So the hologram is unique, it's fixed, it's just one image, but of course you can replay different depth planes. So what you'll see, and I start it, he said optimistically, you should see these begin to come, some of them into focus. Here's one here coming into focus, going out of focus. You can see one here coming into focus, and then we're going back, go back the other way. This one's coming back into focus. So this is all just being, replayed on some powerful GPUs. And the great thing about this is that this is a genuine magnification done by computer, not by, as it were, pixel. So this is, we've zoomed out, this is showing you the whole of the hologram. And you can see quite a complex set of objects. All of these are little bits of pollen. And once again, what you can see is these high frequency fringes, which are just a feature of the fact that you've got a finite aperture, i.e. the lens is not, or indeed the hologram is not infinitely large, and the fact that you have coherent laser light. And this is the sort of effect you always get if you image with coherent light beams. You get essentially the resolution function as a function of spatial frequency, lines per millimeter, is uniform up to a certain cutoff frequency. This is Nyquist sampling essentially, and then it drops to 0. If I'm using conventional, so suppose I was doing the same thing with a green LED to take same color light source but incoherent, it would have twice the maximum resolution, but the contrast falls off essentially smoothly. So at the point where the coherent light is just reaching its limit, the coherent illuminated system is just reaching its resolution limit, the incoherent system is significantly less good in terms of contrast at those frequencies, but will actually record up to higher frequencies. I'm going to go back to sharing the slides again. And that essentially brings me to the end. I thought I'd end up with perhaps a little personal summary. I've worked in holography from particle physics via marine biology to art. And I think the second bullet point is one that I think is a kind of important lesson for me, and maybe I'll pass it on to you, is that what you do in one context may prove indeed not only invaluable, but entirely unexpectedly useful in a completely different area. I would never, ever have predicted that my work on trying to record the decays of charm particles containing the charm quark would have had any impact upon marine biology essentially 20 years, nearly 20 years, 15 years later. Nor would I have predicted, even after doing the marine biology application, that I would then work with an artist to record holograms of pine pollen. So please, please be curiosity driven, and when you can, do remember to have fun. So if there are any other questions, I'm very happy to take them.
Right, thank you, Professor Hobson. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to either write them down or you can say them. But to start some conversation, I thought I'd ask an easy but I thought interesting question. When you were showing us pictures of tracks from the particle beams earlier, I was just wondering, would the beams not be in some way impacted by the different media that the beams are traveling through? But because I was thinking different densities of liquids might have different impacts. I don't know. I was interested.
Well, you're right, obviously, in the sense that the probability of having an interaction in the first place depends on what the liquid is and what its density is. Different bubble chambers over the years use different active media. So typically hydrogen actually was quite commonly used because, of course, it's purely protons. So it's a very simple medium. You know that whatever you're firing into it, a proton, oh sorry, obviously it's got electrons in there as well, but you're looking for pure proton-proton interactions. Sometimes quite some of the noble gases, because they're cryogenic, so people would be using argon or neon or possibly even krypton, I don't remember. I think not, but certainly neon, because they had higher densities, higher average atomic numbers, therefore your probability of interaction was higher. We used this Freon C3F8 for reasons which I now can't actually remember, but probably because it's a reasonable density liquid. So we wanted a system which didn't have to operate at cryogenic temperatures. But you're quite right that the chance of the interaction depends on two things. One, the actual density in, say, grams per cubic centimeter, and secondly, the average atomic number of. So this is low because it's carbon and hydrogen. If you're working with a neon-filled chamber or an argon-filled chamber, then the interaction, the probability would be much greater. And indeed, the absorption of the lower, or the further interaction of the lower energy subsequent mesons, pions primarily, would indeed be more common. What do you think the next steps are in holography? Well, it's a very good question. Holography has been a curious subject. It's always, yeah, for a long time, certainly for a lot of my life. So holography, although it was invented in '46, there were no lasers in '46, and you do really need a decent coherent light source. And Gabor had to make do with mercury lines, so spectral lines, and then throwing away most of the light by putting them through very tiny pinholes. So he was pretty limited in what he could do. I don't think he actually had enough coherence to make off-axis holograms. So with the invention of practical visible lasers, 1960, holography sort of took off in a big way, actually. And it was kind of the solution to everything, but curiously, the solution to nothing. It's certainly been an enabling technology. I mean, it certainly spurred a lot of people to look at other ways of making high resolution three-dimensional images, either using stereoscopy and stereo video, stereo television, or using some rather complicated fisheye-like lenses, which people are making use of now. It's been a pretty niche area. There are only a very few areas where holography is still, in a sense, unrivaled, and it really is in this decoupling of optical resolution, i.e. can I resolve something which is on the scale of a few wavelengths of light, from do I need to know where it is in depth to a fraction of a millimeter, which is what you have to do with a conventional microscope. In that area, I think it's unrivaled. It has come back a little bit, given that we can now make holograms with CCD, CMOS, video cameras, essentially, and video frame rates, and with powerful GPUs, actually even not so powerful GPUs. I think the ones we were using were essentially gaming GPUs. You don't need, a single precision floating point is more than adequate for replaying holograms. It's much easier to make them now. I mean, the original method of making a hologram, where you need big optical tables, powerful lasers, and a lot of kind of technological expertise. It's not exactly miniature technology. So there are a few applications. I think the heyday, let me put it that way, the heyday of holography has probably passed us by. There are people working in art holography still, but you just don't see very many people working in scientific applications.
Okay, another question. The word hologram is often misused in the media and in films, etc.
Oh yes.
You know, in every, Star Wars.
Princess Leia.
Yes, all of this. So I thought, just for fun, I'd ask, how likely do you think some technology like that is going to come around? Could it exist in our lifetime? And what are the major steps that would have to be overcome?
Oh, it's happened. It's already happened. The MIT Media Lab, we're actually in, I didn't mention it, but my artist friend, Jane Wilton, and I actually went to the International Conference on Display Holography in 2012, which was actually held at the MIT Media Lab in Boston, well, across the river, essentially from downtown Boston. And that's a very unusual conference because it's one of the ones where the two sides of holography come together: the science side of holography, which is what I was talking about, and the art side of holography, which, if you like, Jane's contribution was to that. And I think that you're at the MIT Media Lab. I'm trying to think when. Certainly in the 1980s. People were very keen on making real-time color holograms that could be replayed, where the real image could be replayed in space. So moving towards the sort of thing you see, as it were, in Star Wars and millions of other similar applications. And they did actually get something to work. I mean, it was technologically incredibly impressive for 1980 something, and required, again, a huge amount of expertise and massively expensive custom hardware, some very expensive lasers to give you red, green, and blue. And nowadays, you see you'd use solid-state diode lasers. In those days, you had to have huge, literally huge, powerful lasers, gas lasers, krypton and argon, to give you the three colors. And they had some quite impressive. I mean, it didn't look like the sort of thing you'd pay money for to see in the cinema, but it was done. I think what people are doing now is, again, having been inspired by both the fictional hologram and the fact that people then had a pretty good crack for the technology of the time at making real holograms do what the fictional ones did. People have looked at all of these techniques of using very, very fast spinning discs and projecting onto them, which do actually give you a pretty good illusion, genuine illusion of three-dimensionality in a way that, you probably for many purposes will be an adequate solution. I don't think anyone's going to go back. I suspect nobody's going to go back and try and redo the MIT real world replay of real holograms, even with modern hardware. Do I think more effort should be put into researching holography? I think, I'll tell you one area where I think holograms could be really interesting, partly because again, it's because of this decoupling, and that's the search for extraterrestrial life on things like, say, Europa. So some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn certainly have, almost certainly, liquid oceans of something, possibly even water, or water mixed with other things. It doesn't require a huge amount of bandwidth to send back a hologram compared to sending back all of those individual images which would be, you'd have to take, even if you had a static, suppose you had a static scene or you didn't care about things were moving, and you took 1,000 frames of high resolution imagery, say moving a camera 1/4 of a millimeter every step, that's still 1,000 frames of data to send back from a remote probe, and that's actually quite a lot. Whereas you could send back one hologram and replay it on Earth. I think that might just be an area where holography might still have an application. And I did talk at one point with some people about that, and there was some interest, and I certainly absolutely know that NASA, on and off over possibly the last 30-something years, have looked at holography occasionally for doing things of that sort. As far as I know, nobody's ever done it. I'm not sure there are any new holographic techniques to be discovered. People have made all sorts of bizarre holograms, both for scientific and art purposes, and I suspect I mean, volume holograms are ones which you can't do electronically. You have to make that, because they're essentially what's known as a Bragg grating. They're a grating which is not just a surface grating such as you have on a classical diffraction grating, but they're a grating that exists in the volume of something, and you need a thick medium, physical medium. It doesn't have to be film, but it has to be, it could be a crystal, for example. There are certain special types of crystals that you can write gratings in. Bragg fiber gratings are used in optical communication systems, but you can write holograms into volumes as well, and there you can get some interesting effects. I think my life in researching holography has probably come to an end.
Okay, well, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them down below. I just thought I would quickly thank Professor Hobson for joining us. I thought I'd thank you for joining us. As I said, this will probably be put on YouTube, and I thought I'd also just recommend on this topic, sort of on the Princess Leia topic, in Physics World, which is given out to members of the Institute of Physics, in the June 2020 issue, Sound and Vision, there are several articles, and I found them quite interesting, about holograms generated using sound and balls from the University of Bristol and the University of Sussex, where they're hoping to make a hologram of Freddie Mercury singing, with obviously Bohemian Rhapsody, and they're hoping to put it, I believe, in the Victoria and Albert Museum before 2021. I don't know how.
Yeah, I think I read that, and you're right. That generating, I should at least say that generating hologram-like interference patterns in three-dimensional space still does have lots of potentially interesting applications. Holography of the sort I'm talking about, I think, is probably very, very niche indeed. Interesting. Sorry, just to go even back to Princess Leia, the person I ended up working with on this, the other holographer I ended up working with on this European plankton project, I actually met at a conference in London in 1992, in which somebody from, I think it was the Royal College of Art, gave a talk on the mythical hologram, which indeed was about things like Princess Leia, or the visualization that was used for Princess Leia, I should say.
Right, okay. So I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you everyone for coming. We hope you enjoyed, and we certainly can't wait to see you in September, hopefully, where we